So today we are going to take a look at chapter 4, which is another part of biology that you learned as a freshman, and we're going to look at species, interactions, and community ecology. So these are the kinds of things we're going to talk about. The idea of a keystone species, feeding relationships, and energy flow with food webs. We're going to really talk about invasive species and look at some terrestrial biomes. Actually, the terrestrial biomes are going to be a separate section for you guys, so we won't get to that. So the central case study for this chapter is about an invasive species. They're called zebra mussels. So quite a while ago, in the late 80s, zebra mussels had made their way into the Great Lakes through ballast water. Ballast water is water that ships take on to help keep themselves upright so they don't capsize, depending on how much cargo they have. So the more cargo they have, the less ballast water they need. That allows them to not sink when they, or like I said, capsize when they move into shallower or deeper water. So they came from ballast water that ships from Europe had discharged into the Great Lakes. Shortly thereafter, 6 years later, they had spread into the Mississippi River, and they are currently found in over 30 states in the U.S. Okay, so why did they spread so much? They didn't have predators or parasites, and they caused a huge issue with to humans. One of the big human impacts, they clogged these water intake pipes, like you can see here, which didn't allow for water to come into municipal water plants, factories, anything like that. And it also damaged fishing docks, fishing gear, and boats because they just settled onto anything that they could find that was not moving. So any of those things would be good material for them. They cost the Great Lakes economies $5 billion in the first 10 years. So that's human impact. If we talk about ecological impact, they ate they're filter feeders, right? So they ate the algae, the phytoplankton that were in the water. They screened it out, filtered it out. So then the organisms that eat the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, become depleted. And then the organisms that eat the zooplankton become depleted. It's something we're going to talk about in a little bit. For native species, like this big native mussel, this is how tiny they are in comparison. Then because the zebra mussels will attach to anything that's not moving, these mussels tend to be benthic, which means bottom dwelling. So they will attach onto these mussels that are at the bottom, and they seal their valves shut so the shells can't open for gas exchange and any of that. So it's definitely problematic. They have also, the ecosystem has adapted to a degree. At this point, the zebra mussels have kind of peaked, and other species are using the zebra mussels for food, native fish, crabs, and ducks. So they're starting to see a shift in the zebra mussel population as a result of natural predation, native predation, and another mussel that's competing. Okay, let's talk about how species interact, okay, with other organisms in their community. So if you have two organisms that are seeking the same resource, they call that competition. There's, two kinds of competition: intraspecific competition and interspecific competition. Intraspecific competition is between members of the same species. Interspecific competition takes place between members of different species. So if we talk about ways to remember intra versus inter, think about the interstate highway system, like I-95, Interstate 95, or I-78, or I-80. I-95, right, starts up in Maine and runs from Maine all the way down to Florida. It goes through a lot of states. So it goes between different states. Interspecific competition takes place between members of different species. That's the way you can remember it. This is one of our Captain Obvious statements right here. Competition becomes more intense when populations are more dense. The more organisms you have in a small area, the greater the likelihood of competition for resources. Okay. Let's turn on the laser pointer. That's much better. In some cases, if one species is a stronger competitor, they can exclude species. That's called competitive exclusion. And zebra mussels were much stronger competitors than the native mussels. Sometimes species will live together or coexist. And typically what winds up happening, if species are coexisting, they're going to change their behavior to alter their niche. Niche or niche, I say it both ways, is a species role in an ecosystem. Resource use, habitat use, food consumption, and other things, okay? So niches or niches can change periodically depending on availability of resources. One thing that tends to happen is over a series of years, you get something called resource partitioning. So in the picture over here, the resource is this tree. And you've got 4 different species using the same tree in different ways. So you have the brown creeper and the nuthatch. They both look for insects, smaller insects, but the nuthatch starts at the top and works its way down, whereas the creeper starts at the bottom and works its way up. The pileated woodpecker, which is one of the biggest woodpeckers, if not the biggest woodpecker, it's about the size of a duck, and the yellow-bellied sapsucker both drill into the tree bark and deeper into the tree to get insects, but the pileated woodpecker is going to dig deeper than the sapsucker. Okay, so 4 different species use the same resource differently. That's the idea of resource partitioning. So if we look at other relationships, we look at predation, predators and prey. Predation is when one species, which is the predator, is going to capture, kill, and consume individuals of another species, and that's the prey. It's a fatal relationship. The predator kills the prey. As the predator and prey populations change, as the predator population changes, that influences changes in the prey population and vice versa. So if you take a look at this is a really classic example, and you're going to see this in a lab later on in this unit, where you look at the relationships between the hare, which is a rabbit, which is this blue line, and the lynx, which is the red line. So as the predator population, which is the lynx population, goes up, okay, that means there's more organisms to feed, so they're going to eat more hare, right? So the prey population is going to go down because there are a lot of lynx that are hunting, okay? But as the prey population goes down, there's less for the lynx to eat, okay? So then the lynx population starts to drop because they're dying because there's no food resource. As the lynx population drops, that reduces pressure on the hare population, right? Fewer of them are getting killed because there are fewer lynx to kill them. So then they start to reproduce again. So the hare population goes up. Eventually, the lynx population will go up too because the lynx are getting enough food to survive and reproduce. So it's like a dance. As one goes up, the other goes down. So this is an important graph to be able to understand and interpret graphs like these. This is what we talked about in the last chapters 3 and 11. If you have the adaptations that will allow you to get more food, to be a more efficient predator, you're going to have the energy and the stamina to live longer and reproduce. So if you live longer and reproduce, then your traits of better hunting will pass on to your offspring. Prey have an opposite selective pressure. Okay, the threat of death is a selective pressure. So they're going to develop adaptations that allow them to not be eaten. Camouflage is one, warning colorations like a yellow jacket or the poison dart frogs, and then mimicry is another one. The caterpillar looks like a snake head, quite a bit actually. So these are ways that prey species defend themselves against predators. Parasitism, you've probably heard about this, is when one organism depends on the other for nourishment. Parasitism and predation are a little different because predation, it's death for the prey. Parasitism doesn't usually result in death because if the host dies, right, the thing that is giving the nutrients to the parasite, if the host dies, then the parasite doesn't have anything to rely on. So it's more of a usurping of resources, okay, and harming but not killing. So parasites can either live inside the host, on the host, like tapeworms and lampreys, or they can be free living. Cuckoos and brown-headed cowbirds will lay their nests in host species, typically songbird nests, and the babies of these birds are they hatch earlier. They have a smaller in the egg period, and they're bigger, and they're definitely more aggressive. So they will push the native bird babies out of the nest, or they will be big enough to allow the parent bird of the native species to not be able to get to its own babies and feed the babies of the parasite instead. So there's 3 different ways you can be a parasite. If it's a disease that causes a parasite that causes a disease, we call it a pathogen, and protists, bacteria, and viruses can all be parasites and pathogens. Plants can't really defend themselves, but herbivores, it's another kind of predator-prey relationship to a degree. Plants have developed defenses to prevent themselves from being eaten, like you see listed here. Another way of dealing with feeding relationships is mutualism. Mutualism is where 2 or more species live closely together and both of them benefit. Some of them are symbiotic, which is when there's a close physical association between species. You can talk about coral, right? Coral polyps. Coral's an animal, and it's like a sea anemone, a little tiny sea anemone in a cup of calcium carbonate. Coral is a mutualistic symbiotic relationship between that polyp and zooxanthellae algae. Coral's going to die if you touch it too much because it kills that algae coat. So that's a really important mutualistic symbiotic relationship that we have. Another kind of symbiotic mutualistic relationship is pollination, okay? And there's a picture of pollination, a bat and a funky flower. Birds or insects are going to take, or bats, are going to take pollen from one flower to the next to cause fertilization, which then procreates the species. And then the organism that's doing the pollination is going to benefit from it as well. So if we look at a community, it's a group of populations of organisms that are living in the same area at the same time. It's a bunch of different species, okay? So you could be a community ecologist if you're into this kind of thing and look at how communities change over time and why those changes happen. One of the biggest pieces that we look at when we talk about community ecology is who eats whom, okay? Feeding relationships. So a food chain, we talk about a chain, is made up of different organisms at different trophic levels, okay? So the base of all food chains is the producer, okay? So in this case, we have an aquatic food chain that we're going to look at and a terrestrial food chain we're going to look at. Producers take inorganic carbon, right, through either the process of photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, and turn it into organic carbon in the form of sugar. Okay, photosynthesis uses light. Chemosynthesis uses other chemicals that we're going to talk about down the line. All right, producers are consumed by primary consumers. They're the first level consumers. In this aquatic ecosystem, there are zooplankton. In the terrestrial ecosystem that we're going to talk about, it's a grasshopper. Okay, so primary are the first level consumers. Primary consumers get consumed by secondary consumers. These are your first order carnivores. Okay, in the aquatic ecosystem, it's a fish. In the terrestrial ecosystem, it's a rodent. This is a chipmunk. And then you can go up even further in the aquatic food chain, on the terrestrial food chain, and hit tertiary consumers. Okay, they eat secondary consumers. So tertiary means third order. All right. There are a couple organisms that aren't necessarily pictured in this chain. Detritivores, they scavenge waste and dead bodies. So in an aquatic food chain, you're talking about lampreys for the most part. Okay, sea lice in the deep ocean. And some of our terrestrial food chain detritivores are vultures, are some of the biggest ones, vultures and crows. Okay, another thing that's not shown here in the food chain are decomposers. Decomposers are an essential, critical part of a food chain and a community ecology, because they take non-living matter and break it into smaller molecules that go back into the soil. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So you can turn a food chain into a pyramid. Okay. At each trophic level, right, only 10% of the energy from one level makes it to the next level. 90%, so of this 1,900 units, is used to allow this plant to grow, to reproduce, to maintain its systems, or it's lost this heat. Okay, this grasshopper is going to eat plants. Only 10% of the grasshopper's energy goes to the chipmunk, and only 10% of the chipmunk's energy goes to the bird of prey. Okay, so it takes a much bigger population of plants to feed the grasshoppers, because only 10% of that energy goes, right? So a grasshopper does not eat just one plant. It eats a whole bunch of plants to get enough energy to do what it needs to do. Same thing here, right? The chipmunk is not going to eat one grasshopper. It's going to eat a bunch of grasshoppers. And that's going to become really important down the line to us. This idea that it's only 10% of the energy that goes, so the organism has to consume a lot more, which is why it's shaped like a pyramid. You can look at this as a pyramid of energy or a pyramid of biomass, right? The mass of organism at each level. There's a much larger mass of organism at the producer level than there is at the tertiary consumer level, because it takes a lot of plant matter to support that one tertiary consumer. And that's what I just said. Eating at a lower trophic level decreases your ecological footprint. This is a good thing to stop and talk about for a second. So if you are vegan or vegetarian, right? Say vegan, you are essentially a grasshopper, okay? If you are an omnivore, right, and you eat, or carnivore, and you eat, you wind up being a secondary producer. If you are a secondary consumer, sorry. If you are a primary consumer, you get more energy from the plant than you would if you were a secondary consumer, right? Because this, in order to feed you as a secondary consumer, you wind up having to get a lot more plant material to feed a lot more animal to feed you, okay? If you wind up just being a primary consumer, you cut out the middleman, and you wind up with a lot more energy efficiency. So if we look at those food chains, right, it's one organism The energy from one organism is passed to another, to another, to another. But we know that grasshoppers eat a variety of plants, and we know that hawks eat a variety of small organisms. So it's not a really complete map of energy flow. There are other parts to it. So we take a whole bunch of food chains and overlap them into something called the food web, and that gives us a better picture of feeding relationships. Okay, I put a star next to this so you kind of understand what's going on. Arrows here, this is something that messes kids up. Arrows show the flow of energy, not who eats whom, because the grasses and the wildflowers and the herbaceous plants do not eat the deer. The energy from grasses, wildflowers, and herbaceous plants go to the deer, right? So if you look at all the organisms that get energy from grasses, wildflowers, and herbaceous plants, you've got the deer mouse, you've got the eastern cottontail, and you've got the white-tailed deer, okay? A lot of organisms, and even with the white-tailed deer, that's going to eat the wildflowers and herbaceous plants and also the oak, all right? So if you take a look at the tick here, the tick is a parasite, so it gets energy from the white-tailed deer, the cottontail, and the deer mouse, and the chipmunk, all right? The white oak is also consumed by a number of organisms. As you can see, the energy flows from the white oak to the deer, the chipmunk, and the caterpillar. And there we go, okay? So it would complicate this diagram tremendously to show what actually happens. Your soil bacteria are your decomposers. So everything that you see in this picture, from the earthworm to the deer, to the caterpillar, to the blackberry bush, to the tick, once it all dies, all of that energy makes its way down into the soil bacteria for decomposition, okay? So that's an important thing to have to make sure you understand. Everything makes its way back to the soil bacteria. Some organisms play something called an outsized role, okay? Those organisms are called keystone species. This is an important definition to hang on to for the whole entire class. It's got an impact far greater than its abundance, okay? So it's not the biggest population of organisms in the community, but it plays a really important role. So some examples: decomposers, right? Decomposers are really important because they put nutrients back into the soil. Organisms like ecosystem engineers, such as beavers and prairie dogs, they physically alter the ecosystem. Beavers build dams to change courses of rivers, which will then change water flow and provide habitats for all these organisms. And then top predators, which will control populations below them. And we're going to talk about an example of that right now. So it's called a keystone species because of the idea of a keystone in architecture. A keystone in architecture holds up the entire arch, okay? If you pull the keystone out, the arch falls apart, okay? So the example here is a kelp forest, like what's off the west coast of California. There's only one coast in California, off the coast of California, okay? So the sea otter is a keystone species. The sea otter is a top predator. The sea otter eats sea urchins, okay? Sea urchins graze on kelp. So the sea otter eats the sea urchins and allows, then reduces the amount of grazing that the sea urchins do on the kelp, which allows for a really diverse ecosystem to exist in the kelp forest. If you've seen Finding Dory, they talk about that. Dory's home is in the kelp forest, right? So back in the 1800s, when we were colonizing California and exploring and settling California, they hunted the sea otter quite a bit because its fur was water repellent and it was really, really warm. So they hunted the sea otter down to very small numbers. When that happened, there was nothing to keep the sea urchin population in control. So then when that happened, the sea urchins exploded and overgrazed the kelp, which reduced the kelp forest ecosystem for the rest of the population community that relied on it. That's called a trophic cascade. When you pull the keystone out, everything falls apart. Okay, so that's an important concept for you to understand. So we can look at disturbances. Disturbances in the environment are natural. For the most part, there are human-induced ones, which we're going to talk about. So it's any event that has rapid and drastic effects on a community and the ecosystem as a whole. So they can be small and localized, like a tree that falls. They can be big, like a hurricane or anything like that, or a fire, or they can be regular, right? So fires on the prairie are a normal natural thing. Insect outbreaks are also a pretty regular thing. So any community that gets impacted by a disturbance hits it, but it doesn't really affect the community, is said to be resistant. Okay, so it acts like a wall. You can push against a wall and the wall is not going to budge. So it's resistant to the disturbance. Any community that gets hit by a disturbance and changes but comes back to the way it was originally is called, we say that it has resilience. It's a resilient community. These disturbances can happen in a variety of different timescales. Sometimes they're periodic. If it's periodic, it's a regular, predictable interval, like the tides. The tides come in and out every day, depending on where you're located. They can be episodic, which means that they are irregular and unpredictable, but they will happen again. El Nino is one of them. Changes in glaciation, which will then impact sea level, is one of them. And hurricanes. We know that there's a hurricane season, but we don't exactly know when those hurricanes are going to come. So those are episodic. Random events, there's no pattern. It's sporadically. It might not happen for 1,000 years. It might not happen for 100 years, or it might happen every day, depending on the type of volcano you're looking at. So those are some examples of the timescales of disturbances. After a disturbance comes through, depending on the severity, it can really change a community. Or alter or eliminate most of the species in a community. When that happens, you get something called succession. All right? Succession is a change in the number of species over time, or the numbers and types of species over time. So succession starts with a pioneer species. Okay? Pioneer species are small. They are really resistant to pretty harsh areas, right? Pretty harsh conditions. They spread over long distances and they grow really fast. Over time, after succession takes place, the pioneers will fade out and wind up becoming a climax community, which are the biomes that you guys are going to talk about in a little bit, such as hardwood trees. So there's two kinds of succession. Primary succession is the top half, and secondary succession is the bottom half. Something that's really important about primary succession is that primary succession happens when all of the soil is gone. There's no soil, right? So typically that tends to happen when you have, like the Hawaiian Islands, when you have volcanic islands that are being formed where there were no islands before. So you have bare rock, and you have lichens that come in and start to colonize the rock. They break it down with acids and stuff that start the process of soil formation. These lichens are going to die, right? And then start to decompose and really allow soil production to take place, okay? And then your early pioneer species are going to wind up developing through primary succession to be this climax community, okay? Secondary succession is a little different. Secondary succession happens when there's a disturbance, such as farming, around here, it's really common, a farmer's field. A farmer is going to clear the land that's there. They're going to plant what they're going to plant, and eventually, at some point, the farming may stop. And that happened on the property that I live on. My dad farmed the field for a very long time. It was an established field from the 40s until the 70s when he decided to stop farming it. And then what wound up happening over the course of time, there was still soil left behind. There was plenty of soil left behind because it was a field. Okay, so you don't have to go through this process in secondary succession as you do in primary succession to create soil. The soil's already there. So it's just a matter of having the early pioneer species come in and develop into your climax community. And the original climax community may not, before the disturbance happened, may not be what you wind up with at the end. So we can look at introduced species. Introduced species are species that are not native to an area, that were brought in by people. Most of the time, introduced species can't cut it, okay? So they don't survive, okay? So they die off and they're not around anymore. But the ones that thrive are called invasive species. This is a boa constrictor in the Florida Everglades. They are now very invasive down there. Zebra mussels were invasive. They had no natural predators. So that had both positive and negative impacts on the community. The red downward arrows are negative impacts. So to humans, we talked about the economic loss, right? Clogging intake valves and destroying equipment and fishing gear and all that stuff. It reduced the population of phytoplankton because they overate it. And it reduced the population of zooplankton because the phytoplankton didn't have anything to eat. It reduced the plankton-eating fish population because they didn't have anything to eat. And it sullied the native mussels and clams because they couldn't keep anything, they couldn't open their valves. Okay, but it's not all negative. You guys are going to read an article on the impact that the zebra mussels had. So phytoplankton and zooplankton tend to make the water murky. So if you reduce the phytoplankton and zooplankton population, the water's not going to be murky. So what's going to wind up happening is that more sunlight is going to get down into the deeper parts of the water. If you are a benthic plant, right, a benthic aquatic plant, bottom-dwelling plant, you're going to love it. So it just increases the amount of light that you get. So you're going to have this blossoming of aquatic plants. So instead of being an ecosystem in the water column, you're going to wind up developing a benthic ecosystem. So more aquatic plants increases the population of bottom-feeding fish, and the benthic invertebrates, bottom-dwelling invertebrates and bacteria down there are going to have more to eat as well. So it became a shift in the ecosystem that was different than what we were accustomed to in the Great Lakes, but it's not necessarily bad. So you have to get rid of it somehow. It's not easy. So poisoning invasive species, preventing them from coming in, it's typically easier to prevent them than it is to go and eradicate because they tend to spread so fast. So you could be a restoration ecologist, if we're looking at ways to put ecosystems back to the way they were. You want to restore the functionality of an ecosystem if you're a restoration ecologist, and you want to return it to its pre-settlement conditions, whatever it looked like before humans got to it. So here's an example. We dug a lot of canals to divert water flow in Florida, but now we're kind of seeing that that's impacting the Everglades, which is a giant freshwater swamp in central and southern Florida. So we've filled the canals and allowed the river to go back to its normal way. That's an example of restoration ecology at work. So a problem, a downside to restoration ecology is in that as we talk about climate change, different species are changing towards the poles and upward in elevation. We're seeing more severe swings in weather and climate over the course of time. So to realistically take a community from the 1800s, right, to try and put it back to the way it was in the 1800s may not be realistic based on what we see in climate, with the changes in climate. So restoration ecology has a new spin on it. So that is the end of chapter 4.